first time. So very brief background on myself. Kevin Clancy is my name. I'm a performance psychologist by background, and my purpose is really applying psychology to help people, teams, and organizations to be at their best. Um, Very similar to last week, or actually, I should say slightly different to last week. We are going to try to keep this session interactive today, um, but a little different from last week. I paused at different points last week to invite any questions. I'll actually leave the questions to the end today. But if you do have any questions or comments you want to make as we go, please feel free to put them in the chat. Sam's going to be keeping an eye on the chat, and we can answer some of those as we go throughout the session. So I suppose to set the scene for today, then last week we introduced this idea of our model of the brain and how the brain works to you, and really this forms the basis of this entire program. And so just to do a very, very quick recap on these three ideas of the brain, because for those who weren't at the session last week or haven't seen the recording back, it will just provide you with some context as we move through, and maybe if I make some references to these. So the three ideas of the brain that we discussed there, the fast brain. This is really our automatic brain, almost like our subconscious, where all of our skills, habits, experiences, memories are. Our brain loves operating in fast mode because it's really efficient from an energy perspective. So it will tend to default to that as much as possible. That's great in terms of us being efficient, but sometimes can be challenging if there's things that we want to change or if there's things that we want to do differently. But that's the fast brain. The slow brain then is really where we do our rational thinking, our logical thinking happens in the slow brain. Very, very limited in terms of what it can do at any given point in time. You see an image there of a spotlight. That's a good metaphor for how our slow brain works. It can only really zone in on whatever we're focused on at any given time. It is the place where growth, development, and change happens. We want to change anything in our fast brain, any habits, any skills, and want to get better at particular things. The avenue for change to do that is through the slow brain. And then the final idea or area of the brain is the chimp. And our chimp, which is associated with our fight, flight, or freeze mechanism, its goal is survival. It wants to keep us alive and it wants to keep us safe. It tends to be quite emotional in how it deals with things. So the chimp can often be quite irrational. And as I mentioned as well last week, it can be very easy in the story of the brain to paint the chimp as being the bad guy, but that's not the case. Our chimp is really, really important in terms of keeping us safe and in terms of steering us in the right direction when it comes to some of those things. I mentioned last week about a gut feel about something often comes from our chimp. Last week, we really zoned in on the slow brain, and we talked about the idea of being purposeful. And really, if we want to think about ourselves at our best, we need to define what that looks like. And I left you with a little tool, a little reflection exercise to really think about, what do I look like at my best? And how can I start to get a vision or a picture of what that is? Because when we have that vision or picture, then we can start to work towards that. So that was really bringing in the slow brain last week. Today, we're going to start to look at really the second step in our model around being at your best. And that's, how do you build perseverance? So what are the strategies that can help you to be at your best on a consistent basis, or certainly to be heading in a direction towards that? And today we're going to look at three key mindsets in this area. And really what a mindset is simple way of describing it is, it's a lens through which we see the world. So just like if you put on different pairs of glasses, depending on what lens you had there, you'd see things around you in a different way. Works the exact same with our mindsets. So we're going to explore these three different mindsets, and really what we're going to be diving into today then is the fast brain, because the fast brain is really where we store our mindsets, for want of a better phrase. And really, our mindsets are a set of beliefs, around something. So we're going to explore these, and then we're going to be bringing in the slow brain also, because this is, if we want to reflect on these and we want to change these and we want to do something differently with these mindsets, the slow brain is the way that we can do that. So the three mindsets we're going to look at today then are, the first is around responsibility, and really thinking about, where do you see the responsibility lying in your life? Because where you perceive the responsibility to be will have a huge impact on the way you think, the way you feel, and the actions that you take. We're also going to look at this idea of, how can you be a realistic optimist, or the topic of realistic optimism. To be at your best is absolutely what we're all striving towards doing, but we're going to meet challenges along the way. It's inevitable. And really, a key part of this and a big mindset is around, how do we deal with those challenges so that they don't drag us down into the negative side of things, and we can keep this level of realistic optimism. And then the third area that we're going to look at is really the mindset around identity. Who we are and who do we perceive ourselves to be? Because again, that has a big effect on the actions we take, the way we think, the way we feel about things. So that's a little overview of what we're going to cover. As I said, as we move through, feel free to put questions in the chat box. The first area we're going to look at, or the first mindset we're going to look at, is the idea of responsibility. And as a way of understanding this, I'm going to use a very well-researched psychological concept that some of you may have come across previously and others may not have. It's called the locus of control. And locus is a Latin or a Greek word, I believe, which essentially means location. So this looks at the location of control, and where do you perceive the location of control to be in your life? And as I'm sure you can imagine, where you perceive the location of control to be has a big impact on how you actually go about living your life. And the locus of control would suggest that, or the theory would suggest that, in any given situation or moment in time, we as people can move into one of two different frames of mind: an external locus of control or an internal locus of control. And as we go through this, I just invite you to reflect. I won't be asking anybody this, but I just invite you to reflect yourself on, where do you spend time? And is there one of these that you spend more time in than the other? Because it is important to say straight up, nobody spends their time exclusively in the external frame of mind, and nobody spends their time exclusively in the internal frame of mind. We tend to move between the two depending on situations that we experience. However, you will tend to spend more time in one over the other. And that's what I invite you to reflect on and think about as we go through this. So the external locus of control, so this frame of mind is somebody who spends a lot of time in this frame of mind, is somebody who perceives that they are not in control of what they think, feel, say, or do. So if you put yourself in that position of somebody who they perceive they're not in control of what they're thinking, feeling, saying, or doing, and something was to go wrong for that person, just think about where the blame is likely to lie. If I don't perceive that I'm in control over what I'm thinking, feeling, saying, or doing, something goes wrong, it's likely that I'm going to point the blame outside. It's always going to be somebody else or something else's fault. And on the flip side of that, if things were to go right for me, operating out of this external locus of control, then I'm likely to feel like, well, I'm not in control of these things. So it must be that everything outside of myself just came together and that I got lucky. And a nice little metaphor to think about here in terms of understanding this external locus of control is, if you imagine that you were a cork bobbing along in the middle of the ocean, and you decide that your goal is you want to get to an island over here in this direction. Have a think about how likely you are to get to that island. Right? If you're a cork and you don't have any means of moving yourself, well, you're going to be reliant on the current, you're going to be reliant on winds, you're going to be reliant on maybe a fish coming along, picking you up and dropping you off on the island. Now, there is a possibility that you will get to the island, but the chances of it happening are fairly limited. You need all these things outside of yourself to come together to be able to achieve that. That's what somebody who spends a lot of time in an external locus of control frame of mind, that's what their existence is like. So they will have goals they want to achieve. Absolutely, they will have islands that they want to get to, but they're relying on everything and everybody outside of themselves to be able to do that. If we look at the internal, then the internal is somebody who perceives that they are in control over what they think, feel, say, and do. So again, if you think about if something was to go right for somebody in an internal frame of mind, sorry, if something was to go wrong for somebody in an internal frame of mind, they're much more likely to say, well, I must have contributed to that going wrong, or I must have some responsibility for that going wrong. And on the flip side, then, if somebody spends a lot of time in that internal frame of mind and something goes right, they're much more likely to say, well, I must have contributed to that going right. I must have had some responsibility in things going right in that situation. And again, if we use our metaphor of the ocean, if you imagine that you're the captain of a ship in that ocean, and you decide that your goal is that you want to get to an island over here, just think about how likely you are to be able to achieve that goal. So you're still going to be at the mercy of the currents, the winds, or outside factors. But the difference is, if you get dragged off in one direction, you can steer back and head in the direction that you want to go to. Now, it doesn't absolutely guarantee that you're going to get to the island, but it certainly gives you a much better opportunity of doing so. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'd invite you to think about, where do you spend most of your time here? And I have a theory here. When I ask that question to groups, I always feel that people think, oh, I definitely spend most of my time in the internal locus of control. What research would actually suggest, in a whole range of different settings and scenarios, is that the majority of people actually spend most of their time in the external locus of control. And if we look at the reasons for this through the lens of the brain, or through a neuroscience lens, that actually makes sense, because our brain is all about efficiency and all about conserving energy. And the easy frame of mind to go into always is the external, because it's always going to be somebody else's fault, or it's always going to be something else. It actually requires a lot of energy and a lot of deliberate focus to stay in the internal, which is harder for us to do as humans. But research will also tell us that the payoff from staying in the internal more often than not is enormous. People who spend most of their time in an internal locus of control will tend to report being happier, have greater levels of life satisfaction, and will tend to have better health outcomes also. So again, it goes back to, where do you spend your time? And as you consider that question, also consider, when you're stressed, when you're really under pressure, where do you tend to go to? Because that'll communicate something of the beliefs or the mindset that you have in the fast brain, and it'll tell you something about how your chimp responds as well when it comes to pressure. So the key then is thinking about how can we operate in that internal locus of control as much as possible. And it's not easy to do. As I just mentioned, it does require energy and it does require deliberate focus. Viktor Frankl, who referenced last week around meaning and purpose, he has a great insight around this idea of where we choose to go when it comes to the locus of control. And he says, quote is around between stimulus and response, there's a space. And it's in that space that we have the power to choose our response. And it's in our response lies our growth and our freedom. And so stimulus is, for example, where your partner or friend or a work colleague makes that comment that really annoys you and frustrates you and gets at you. And just like we all naturally do as humans, our chimp will start to jump up in that scenario, and we'll typically have a fast brain response because we've experienced that before, and we might go back and do what we've always done. But there is a gap there. There is a space there, and it can be very, very brief. It's that space where you maybe feel that anger and that frustration maybe starting to build up throughout your body, where you choose, what am I going to do in this situation? How am I going to respond in this situation? And this is often the difference between us going into the external frame of mind or the internal frame. Because in that space, what we really want to think about is, what's my contribution in this situation? Or another way of putting this is, what do I have responsibility for or control over in this situation? Because our partners or our friends or our work colleagues, we don't actually control what they're going to do. We can't control what they're going to say, much and all as sometimes we would like to. It's really how are we going to respond? And it's also thinking about what we refer to as the CIA model. So what's in our control in any given situation? What can we influence? And what are the things that are outside of our control and influence that we just have to accept? And I would actually argue, even with the theory or the research around the locus of control, would suggest that the things that are within our control are our thoughts, our feelings, what we say, and what we do. I would actually say that in reality, that's actually it's even narrower than that. Because I firmly believe that our thoughts and feelings tend to be quite automatic. Yes, and they tend to come from our fast brain, or they tend to come from situations where we're reacting based off previous experience, not necessarily from the experience in the moment. So I would actually say the only things that are within our control are really what we say and what we do, how we respond to a situation. Now, often people will say to me, that's kind of depressing that we have that limited control over anything. But I'd actually argue back. I actually think that's a really, really good thing, especially from a brain perspective, because what that does is that narrows our focus. All we can do in any given situation is be in control over what we're going to do, how we're going to respond, and what we're going to say back if it's a situation where we're in a conversation. So it's really, really thinking about this for yourself, and even simple exercises here, and often the most simple exercises are the most powerful, is if you're having a challenging situation with someone, or you're having a challenging situation in your life, going back to first principles and actually sitting down and saying, okay, in this situation, what is actually in my control? What are the things that I can influence? What are the things that I just have to accept? And then measuring that up against your behavior and saying, well, am I actually putting most of my energy into the things that I can control? Or am I putting most of my energy into things that actually I just need to accept, for example? So that's the first mindset. That's around responsibility. I might just pause there for a second or just pass to you, Sam. Is there any questions in the chat?
No questions, but a good comment from Louise. Just my flight or flight goes to internal. I go full what do, oh, sorry, it went away. What do I have to do to fix things, and very logical. Kind of
Yeah.
think that we all feel that way sometimes.
Do you want to maybe ask that question, Louise? I don't fully understand it. I can't just see the chat at the moment.
Yeah, I was just responding to you asked which kind of
Oh,
way do you leave, internal or external? And for me, if it's like something big has happened and it's more like crisis, I tend to go in internal and be like, how do I fix things? It's like, okay, I've got to go do this, 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 and this, and then it'll all be okay. But then in day to day, I'm more external and I'm emotional, and I'll let that kind of emotion take over and get into a tizzy over burning a pot of food or whatever. But
and that's a really interesting insight, Louise, like for you yourself. And like a big part of this is actually reflecting on what happens in your situation. So from what I'm hearing, from what you're saying, when the big crisis happens, you take control and you take command, but it's more
yeah,
the little bits and pieces. So probably something for you to reflect on, and this is something that we all need to reflect on as well, is how do you take a similar approach to the small things?
mm,
And how you just make this then become a habit, that's where you tend to go to, that becomes your default, because that's what will happen over a period of time. The more you go to that internal space, the more it just becomes your default. Leading on from this idea then of responsibility and locus of control actually leads into our second mindset, which looks at the idea of optimism and the idea of being a realistic optimist. And I'm going to share a story with you because it gives a really nice insight into this concept. In 1965, long time ago now, there was an admiral in the US Army, a guy called Jim Stockdale. And he was in Vietnam, fighting in the war over there. And his plane got shot down by the Vietnamese. And he got interned in what became an infamous prisoner of war camp called the Hanoi Hilton. And he was locked up there for just under 8 years. He didn't get out until 1973. And Stockdale was the highest ranking American official to have been captured by the Vietnamese. And as a consequence of that, he was a target for torture, in particular from the prison guards. And he experienced a whole range of different tortures. But just to give you one insight, there were times where he was locked in a cell on his own for weeks on end, and there were other times where his legs would be locked in braces for days and days on end. And it was something that even when he got out of the prison at the end, he actually had a limp as a consequence of this. But Stockdale was someone who spent most of his life in that internal locus of control frame. And he realized very early there was a whole range of things that he could do nothing about in this prison. But he could control his own responses to things, and how he interacted with the guards, and how he handled himself, and how he could be a role model for some of the other prisoners who were locked up with him. And one instance of this was, the guards came to him one day and they brought him into a room and they said, you need to get yourself cleaned up because we're going to bring you out and we're going to be taking your photograph. And they left him with materials to get himself cleaned up. And he realized that what they were likely doing was they were bringing him out and they were going to take a photograph of him looking reasonably well, and they were going to then use that as a propaganda tool to send around the world. So what he decided to do was he took the razor that they'd given him to shave and he made incisions all along the top of his head. And he took stool that was in the room and he began to beat himself over the head with the stool, essentially marking and disfiguring his face so that he couldn't be used as a tool for propaganda. Now, Stockdale, as I said, got out in 1973, and years later, there was a guy from a completely different area, a guy called Jim Collins, who was doing research for a book which was looking at what was it that separated the great companies, the great organizations of the 20th century from those organizations that were just regarded as being good. And one of the ideas he kept coming back to was this idea of resilience. And in order to better understand resilience, he decided that he would go and he would interview Jim Stockdale. And one of the first questions that Collins asked Stockdale was, who was it that didn't survive in the Hanoi Hilton? And Stockdale said, oh, that's easy. It was the optimists. Collins said, I don't understand. He said, surely the optimists will be the ones who will be most likely to survive in a situation like that. And Stockdale said, no, he said, the problem with the optimists was that they kept saying, by Christmas, they're going to come and they're going to get us out of here. Christmas would come and go and nobody would arrive. And then they'd say, by Easter, they're going to come and they're going to get us out of here. And the same thing would happen, and the same thing would happen in summer and Christmas again. And he said, eventually it was like the optimists died almost of a broken heart. And Collins then asked Stockdale, well, how did you survive in the Hanoi Hilton? And he gave him this response. He said, this is very important. You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever that might be. So again, if we go back to Stockdale, as I mentioned, very, very much took an internal locus of control frame of mind to this situation, whereas the optimists were much more external. It was about relying on somebody else to come and to rescue them. And he realized that if he was going to survive and if he was going to get out, he needed to have absolute faith that he was going to prevail in the end. And his belief was that he was going to get out of this prison eventually, and this was going to be the defining feature of his life, or the defining moment of his life, I should say. But at the same time, he needed to confront the brutal facts of the situation he was in. He couldn't afford to bury his head in the sand. And some of the brutal facts from him were that he was locked up for 23.5 hours every day. He was going to be subjected to torture. He was going to have limited food. He was going to have no communication or access with his family. He was going to be isolated for long periods of time. They were the brutal facts that he had to come to terms with. And this balance between having faith and confronting the brutal facts, this has come to be known as the Stockdale paradox. And it's very, very powerful in terms of us thinking about how can we operate at our best on a consistent basis. Because really what we need to think about is the faith, in this instance, is us thinking about, well, what do I look like at my best? And that goes back to the exercise that I invited those of you who were here last week to do. Really define that vision, that picture of yourself at your best. At the same time, you need to confront the brutal facts of your situation. So these are things that are happening in your life, in your personal life, in your career, in your relationships, in your health, whatever it is, that you need to actually identify and confront. And what, in my experience, what a lot of people tend to do, and again, going back to how our brain works, this is understandable, is we tend to bury our head in the sand sometimes around the brutal facts. We don't want to confront some of those things because we think if we confront them, that's going to actually have a negative impact on our situation. Whereas actually having them out in the open, looking at them, recognizing them for what they are, getting the support around them if needs be, is actually a really powerful exercise. And it can seem a little bit counterintuitive, but it is very, very powerful for us. Because then it's really about looking at, how can I be at my best in spite of the brutal facts of my situation. I'll give you a very simple example of this, just something that's happened to me in the last few weeks. So part of my story of me at my best, or my vision of me at my best, is a very high level of health and well-being, right? So I do this work not just because it's a job. I firmly believe, and I'm very passionate, that if people have a high level of well-being, then it's going to be a pathway to a higher level of performance in whatever it is that they're doing. And a big pillar of my health and well-being has been physical exercise, and in particular running. So I was a cross-country runner in school. I got to my mid-20s and I started to run marathons, and I've run half marathons and 10Ks, and just running has been a regular part of my life. I'd be running 2 or 3 times a week, typically, at least 2 or 3 times a week. In the last 12 months, I've noticed a little bit of a dull ache, is the best way I could describe it, in my left hip. But I've kind of ignored it because it hasn't affected me enough to actually do anything about it. But a couple of weeks ago, I was chatting to a sports doctor in a team that I work with, and I just happened to mention it to him, and he said, "Look, I'll take a look at it for you." And he did an examination, and within a couple of minutes, he said to me, "You're in big trouble." He said, "You're going to need to get an MRI, but I would suggest that you're probably going to need a hip replacement, just from the bits and pieces that I've seen, that your hip is very, very little range of motion, and it's probably a genetic thing, and it's relatively common." Next question I asked him was, "Will I be able to run anymore?" And he said, "Look, you could, if you continue running." He said, "All it's going to do is it's going to quicken the process, and it's going to make things worse." So in that situation, and it's something that I'm still dealing with at the minute, but I could choose to just ignore that. I could just choose to ignore the brutal fact that my hip isn't up to running anymore. And I could probably get away with it in the short to medium term. Or I can choose to say, look, a brutal fact is, for me to be at my best, I want a high level of health and well-being, but a brutal fact is I'm not going to be able to do that through running anymore. And then it's looking at, well, how can I be at my best in spite of that brutal fact? And maybe it could be that I go cycling instead, or maybe it could be that I go swimming instead, or I find something else that's not going to have the same negative impact, but that's going to give me the same outcome. And again, that's a very simplistic example, but it is really thinking about these things. What do you look like at your best having that vision? What are the brutal facts? How can you get to your best in spite of the brutal facts of your situation? Now, the final area that I want to just touch on with you, and it's the third mindset, and it's around the idea of identity. When I graduated as a performance psychologist close to 20 years ago now at this stage, long time ago, the prevailing belief at the time was that in order to achieve something, you really needed to look at what was the outcome that you wanted to achieve, what was the goal that you wanted to achieve. You then needed to look at the process of how you got there, and without it ever being really spelled out, what that essentially did was that dictated who you became as a person. And this was the prevailing belief that was there in the research, and it was also the prevailing belief that was out there in terms of applied settings. So not long after I graduated, I came across the story of a guy called Joe Simpson. And some of you may have come across Joe Simpson previously. 1985, he was climbing a mountain in the Andes. I'll give you a shortened version of the story. Climbing a mountain in the Andes with a friend of his. On the way back down, they ran into a blizzard and they ran into trouble. And basically, Joe Simpson and his friend were tied by a rope. His friend assumed that Simpson had died because there was nothing happening at the rope and they were a good distance apart from each other. He ended up having to cut the rope, make the decision around whether he stayed and waited and they both potentially perished, or whether he cut the rope and gave himself some opportunity getting back to base camp. He made the horrific decision of having to cut the rope. Simpson, what had actually happened, Simpson, was that he was actually dangling off the edge of a crevasse. When the rope was cut, he dropped. He was very, very lucky. He dropped about 20 feet and he dropped onto another crevasse, but he broke his leg in the process. Now, from where he'd fallen, Joe Simpson knew that it was roughly about a 5-mile trek to get back to base camp. And he knew that there was going to be somebody at base camp for the following 3 days. So he made a decision, okay, what do I need to do in order to get back to base camp? And he created a splinter for himself for his broken leg. And he basically hopped and he crawled. And he made it within hours of the rest of his group leaving the camp. And he survived as a consequence. Now, to me, as a performance psychology student coming out into the world, this story was perfect, because this story communicated exactly what I've got on the screen there. What you did if you wanted to excel at something was you decided what your outcome was going to be, what your goals are going to be, how you're going to get there, and then that dictated who you became. What I've realized is that that thinking was flawed. And I came to this conclusion partly through developments in research and reading other research in this area, but also partly working with people who had actually achieved their goals. They'd gotten to the top of the mountain. They'd gotten to the outcomes that they wanted to get to. And they were miserable as a consequence. Spent a lot of time in Australia, and whilst there, I used to coach a lot of CEOs and Big Four partners and people who had really, really excelled and done incredible things in their lives. And I kept coming across this idea of people feeling like they'd gone after their goals, they'd given up a huge amount to get to their goals. And then when they got there, they were miserable as a consequence. And it got me rethinking this whole model. And what I believe now is that it's actually flawed to think just solely about outcomes and the outcomes that we want to achieve. They're still important and they still have a place. But actually where we need to start with is, we need to start with identity. We need to start thinking about who we are and who is the person that we want to become. And that's the thing that drives our outcomes, with the goals that we're trying to achieve. And then the goals that we're trying to achieve, that will dictate the process of how we're going to get there. I'm going to share with you a very short video clip here, which gives a really, really good insight into an identity-focused mindset in action. Give a very short context on this. You're going to see Dan Carter, who's an ex-All Black New Zealand rugby player, talking in this clip. And between 2004 and 2011, the All Blacks New Zealand rugby team were the best team in the world without winning a World Cup in that time. They'd flopped at their only opportunity in 2007. And they were heading into a home World Cup. So the World Cup in 2011 was going to be held in New Zealand. Dan Carter was widely regarded as being the best rugby player in the world at the time. And very early in the tournament, he got an injury that ruled him out of the entire tournament, ruled him out of what was potentially the biggest moment in his life up to that point. I'm just going to play this clip just in terms of giving a bit of an insight into how he dealt with this and how he adopted an identity-focused mindset in order to do so.
So 2011, a Rugby World Cup at home. I was 28. I was at the peak of my career. And then we went off to the final training of the week. I kicked the ball and I just fell to the ground. We went to the hospital, did an MRI scan, and I asked her, is my World Cup over? And she was like, yes. And I went into my hotel room. My wife came in, my teammates came in, coaches came in, and there was just nothing to say. And it was probably one of the hardest moments of my career. But then I reminded myself of, well, actually, remember that first test match you played for the All Blacks? What was your vision? That's right, it's to be an All Black great. Well, what does an All Black great do in a situation like that? Well, he puts the team first. So all of a sudden I was like, right, I've got to walk out of this change room. I've got to help the new players that are coming in playing my position. I have to reset goals. So I re-signed a new contract for another 4 years to try and play in another World Cup in 2015. So through this horrible injury, I learned some really important tools to help me deal with setbacks. One of them was, it's okay to grieve. So I always give myself a 24-hour period and then go, right, close that, change my mindset, positivity, reset my goals, work out where I want to go to, what I need to do, what's the process to help me walk towards my vision.
So if you think about Carter in that situation, he's worked a huge portion of his life to get to a point where he's one of the top rugby players in the world. He's playing at a home World Cup. If his whole mindset was built around achieving the outcome of winning a World Cup for the All Blacks, but his whole world would have come crashing down as soon as he picked up that injury in 2011. But actually what he'd done is he built his mindset around an identity. What does it mean to be an All Black great? That's what he'd started with. And then an outcome of that would be to win World Cups and win Player of the Year and do all these different things. But it was to be an All Black great. And when this challenge happened then, it was easier for him to shift towards, okay, what does an All Black great do in this situation? How do I help my teammates? How do I help the group? How can I contribute something different here? And to me, it's a really, really good example of that in action. And I'm going to leave you with this, just a couple of tools around this. So this is an identity that I've tried to create around myself. And this is just to give you an idea of what this can look like. I've put a huge amount of reflection and thought into this over the years. And I aspire to be the type of person who supports, educates, and challenges people around the impact that their thoughts and feelings have on their actions. My outcomes, my goals come after that. This is the type of person that I want to be. My outcomes and goals come out of that. What I leave you with, and this is something again for you to go away and to think about for yourself, is what would your identity focused mindset look like? Right. So in the first workshop, I left you with a reflection where it was really thinking about what do you look like at your best. And it was really thinking it was really internal to yourself, thinking from yourself inside. With this, I'd invite you to think actually of people that you interact with, people that you admire, that you look up to. So you think of up to 3 people who would fall into that category. What are the things about them that you most admire or find inspiration? And what does this then say about the type of person that you are, you aspire to be? And also you can link this in with the exercise from workshop 1 around how does it align with you at your best? And you can then come up with a statement if that's something that you want to develop also. So I'm conscious of the time, folks, and I know I've gone probably 60 seconds over now. Sam is jumping up and down at me. So no. Very, very quickly, just to wrap up, it's really thinking about 3 mindsets. We want to build perseverance towards our best. It's really thinking about responsibility. It's thinking about how can I be a realistic optimist? And it's thinking about that identity. How can I develop an identity-focused mindset? I'm happy to stay on the line if anyone has any questions. I know that some people have to jump. So happy to stay on the line if anyone has any questions. And the easiest way of connecting with me outside of the session is via LinkedIn. Thanks, folks, for your energy and attention today. As I said, if anyone wants to stay on for questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Just a reminder for everyone, so the feedback survey is in the chat. If you can just complete that for us. There is also a section where you can ask questions to Kevin if you need to also jump now. So, but otherwise, thanks everyone for joining.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Dave, do you have a question?
Not so much a question, just the story Kevin gave about Dan Carter. My mum's a big rugby fan, and I took her to some of the 2015 World Cup matches in the UK. We watched New Zealand versus Georgia, and I remember that clip you played. I remember seeing it with Dan Carter about his mindset. There's like in New Zealand, they did like a 4-part kind of series about it as well, where he did talks, and then like the other players talked about Dan Carter and how his focus went back to the team and not himself. And then in 2015, you know, they won the World Cup two times in a row, and he became player of the tournament. And there was just if you've not seen it, I'm sure you may have done, it's like a 3 or 4-part kind of New Zealand produced documentary about him as well, about his mindset and how he kind of went about it. So just when you played that clip, I was like, I remember seeing that. So.
Ah, really? Dave? I actually haven't seen that documentary. I've loads of stuff on him, so I'll check that out. You reckon it's online somewhere?
I'm sure I saw it on YouTube. I think I picked it up in the end, but I just remember him getting that injury in 2011. So I just remember my mum having the Kiwi, the All Black shirt, and like Carter on the back, you know, because she's just nuts for the All Blacks. But yeah, you saw that, you played that clip, and I was like, I remember that clip. You beat your playing. I remember that. I remember that distinctly. So yeah, happy memory from too long ago now, sadly, but
a while ago now.